Good afternoon. Privateers and profiteers. How and why are they undermining public education? As we near the end of the Obama administration, it's a good time to take a closer look at what has happened to public education over the past 7 years. Some very powerful people have used money and the political influence that money buys to undermine and set the stage for the elimination of public education as we have known it for the past 100 years. To be sure, public education has always been flawed and in some ways deeply flawed, but there was an aspiration in what the Washington State Supreme Court recently called common schools, that we should have schools funded and governed by our citizens, that serve all members of our communities. That social compact is in the process of being ripped up by people who believe that in the absence of a profit motive, public institutions are incapable of innovation. How is this being done? There are two major thrusts underway. The first project is to transfer tax dollars out of public schools and into private charters. Parochial schools, private schools, semi-private charters. Organizations like the Gates, Walton, and Broad Foundations have promoted charter schools as the way to, quote, break the public school monopoly. Charter schools will insist that they are public, but any time there is a legal conflict, they will state over and over again that they are private entities. In California, charter operators go to their authorizing public agency only once every few years for a perfunctory renewal. Only in cases of gross malfeasance is a charter ever revoked. Other than this, public oversight is next to nil, which is one reason a recent report found that nearly $4 billion in federal funds have disappeared into a black hole of fraudulent charter schools, some of which took millions of dollars and never even opened their doors. And these schools divert scarce public funds while rejecting students that are disabled or have behavior issues. A New York charter school was recently found to have a list of 16 students tagged "Got to Go." These students were being pressured to leave the school. The second major effort is to revolutionize schooling through technology. Some of the same philanthropists are engaged in this effort as well. The idea is that we could save a lot of money if the latest educational technologies were deployed in our classroom. We could have students learn from computerized educational games or videotaped lessons. Class sizes could increase to 150. Low-paid technicians could work alongside one or two teachers to monitor students and make sure they were on task. This is the rocket ship charter model, and it hasn't worked so far in its most pure trial. And a large part of this vision has driven the Common Core standards, largely sponsored by the Gates Foundation and embraced and promoted by the Department of Education, which invested $330 million to develop tests aligned to the standards. A large motivator for these standards was the creation of a uniform market for technology products. Bill Gates compares classrooms to electric sockets and points out how a standard electric socket design allows appliance makers to innovate and create all sorts of devices that can be plugged into these sockets. In this analogy, our curriculum ought to be standardized, and of course then we have standardized tests to see the results. Then we can compare one educational product to another, one computer game to another, one teacher to another, all based on these test scores. To be clear, I do not think all the people promoting these things are nefarious, greedy money grubbers. I think most of them genuinely believe these solutions will help teachers and students. But there are some core elements of faith driving these visions that I don't think are supported by the evidence. The first element is that in the absence of a drive for profits, education will remain stagnant. I was in the classroom for 18 years, and my colleagues and I were constantly innovating. That sometimes even involved technology, like when I started an all-girl tech class that met before the regular school day. But often it was innovative ways to collaborate, to observe one another and learn together. We benefited from some grant money, but it didn't cost much. We weren't in it for the money. We were trying to get better as teachers, trying to serve our students better. because we felt empowered, we owned our teaching, and we took responsibility for it. Schools are capable of wonderfully effective innovations. Look at the Performance Standard Consortium schools in New York, which have significantly higher graduation rates than the city average, especially for English learners. I visited there last February and saw 500 teachers gathered together for workshops led by their peers on all sorts of instructional and educational topics. The staff at these schools decides what the students need to learn, and the students put together extensive portfolios which they must defend in order to graduate. This is the most rigorous process you could design. It is individualized, not standardized. It allows for excellence to emerge. It doesn't require everyone and everything in the system to be standardized for the convenience of innovators working outside of the school. The second article of faith in operation here is that new technologies are capable of transforming schools and making them far more efficient. Learning occurs in the context of human relationships, and the relationship that a teacher has with her students is a hugely powerful lever for learning. That relationship is undermined when we begin evaluating teachers based on test scores and when we micromanage teachers, pressuring them to teach to the tests. Charter schools have not been shown to offer any great significant academic advantages to the students who attend them, and they exact a huge cost from their communities. Educational technologies aren't worthless, but they haven't been shown to bring the huge efficiencies that their promoters have promised. Things like MOOCs have really been huge disappointments, even though they were promoted as being the answer to everything. Things like videotaped classrooms. These things have their niche. They have a place to play in supporting the classroom instruction, but they're not going to take the place of a really skilled teacher. So in the past decade, we have seen reforms driven by this vision of making education more efficient, more profitable, and more technologically advanced. We really haven't seen any advances in learning, however, judging from the latest NAEP results that show learning in fact has stagnated under the gauntlet of all of these reforms. And why is that? You might have read a book a few years ago by a man named Daniel Pink called Drive: The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. In this book, Pink showed a great deal of evidence that we're motivated by three major intrinsic drives. First, autonomy. We're at our most creative when we're responsible for our own work. The second major motivator is mastery. We want to get better at what we do. We do not need to be forced to do this by threats of a lousy evaluation or that we might be fired. We want to be better. And lastly, and this applies to educators most of all, a sense of purpose. We have a strong sense of purpose that drew us to this profession and that enlivens our work every day. This understanding explains why many of the carrot and stick elements of corporate reform simply aren't working, either for students or for teachers. What would education reforms look like with a more humanistic vision? We need reforms that build on these intrinsic motivators rather than undermine them for both students and teachers. We should see class sizes shrink because this allows teachers to provide more individual attention to students. Especially in high poverty schools, we should have classes of less than 20 students. This will allow teachers to feel they are serving their higher purpose, really reaching their students. It also provides time for teachers to do the sort of formative assessments that, with meaningful feedback to their students, that really is the strongest promoter of growth. We should give teachers time to collaborate, and they should own this professional work. They should have the latitude to choose avenues for their own growth because this autonomy is a huge source of motivation. We should ask communities to reinvest in their schools with their tax dollars and their children. When all of us send our children to common schools, we can begin to live by the golden rule that much better. We should give students autonomy too, and a sense of purpose for their education that goes beyond the next high-stakes test. That means project-based learning and connection to real issues in their lives and their communities. It means art. It means music. It means things that resonate with those students themselves and allow them to express themselves as real autonomous human beings. We must reverse the past decade's trend of increased racial and economic segregation. Charter schools have made this worse, but this issue affects all public schools. The greatest progress we have made in education was in the 70s and 80s, when desegregation was underway. Parents and guardians are huge assets to our schools, and we should find ways to have them more involved in making decisions and in connecting our students' lives to their schoolwork. Our schools are porous places, closely connected to the social and economic health of our communities. We can't pretend that schools can address all social problems by themselves, nor can we pretend that a college education is a sure ticket to the middle class. We need increased social services for all students, and we need real economic opportunities in communities that have been all but abandoned. Education is the most human of endeavors, and the promise of innovation in our schools has always been in the creative spirits of teachers and students. There may not be a lot of money to be made for investors, but it's time for educators, parents, and students to be put back in charge of our schools. Thanks very much.